family. Hope you're all right. Um, again, this isn't the recording from last night's thing. So I don't know. They said something, and I don't know. So I just want to thank y'all. I mean, obviously, especially Danny for trying to get this, help me to understand it. But they were saying something that they couldn't give me the control or something. So I don't know. But anyway, let me just kind of move forward. Give me about 30 minutes or so of your time. I want to get a few things that I didn't say in class yesterday. Um, so I want to start with my mentor, my brother, my big brother, Eddie Glaude. He teaches at Princeton. Eddie Glaude says that America's original sin was not slavery. It wasn't the genocide of even native peoples. He says America's original sin is the belief that white lives or white people matter, excuse me, more than others, and that that belief, combined, if you will, with greed, has distorted and disfigured our democratic way of living or of life. If we really are to become a better people or better persons in a country, or a better country, I should say, Eddie says that we have to tell ourselves a different story about who we are. We have to not tell ourselves about America's virtue that somehow secures our innocence. Dare I say to you that we've been talking about this discussion of the Color of Law book, our country is not going to change until it looks at itself in the mirror and asks the question, what do we really mean by equity or diversity or inclusion? What do we really mean by democracy or even freedom? Like a freedom that is tethered, if you will, excuse me, tethered to a lie? I mean, it's superficial at best, right? It preserves the ugly parts. I mean, every day we are sort of confronted with stories about our past, our current state, and how do we get here? Well, it is the time. It is really past time that our country confront the lie that sustains its innocence and covers the crime of structural racism and the legacy of racist actions and policies. And Richard Rothstein obviously has written a very important and even provocative book we talked about the other day in The Color of Law, this sort of forgotten history, right, of how government segregated America. At the start of the book, right, I want to make sure you read it. At the very start of the book, um, Rothstein boldly asserts that contrary to what many others have or sort of believe about segregated neighborhoods in this country, they did not result mostly from individual prejudices or personal choices or actions of such even private institutions, right, as banks or real estate agencies, which he would call what, de facto, right? But he says that it was a consequence of public policy, a purposeful, systematic, forceful government action. And maybe we might ask, which obviously is de jure, right? And maybe you may ask, well, isn't residential by race segregation unconstitutional? by the state? Well, it's clear enough today, right? In today's lecture, we'll kind of mention the kind of the time period, but Richard talks about even John Roberts, our Chief Justice, right? And some of his colleagues on the Supreme Court have remained kind of ill-informed about the government's role and its devastating impact on the lives, especially of Black Americans. And so, in this text, that hopefully you have read at least 2 to 3 or 4 chapters, it describes how laws and policy decisions passed by federal and even state and local governments promoted sort of discriminatory patterns and development of racially segregated, homogenized sort of neighborhoods. Explicit sort of racial zoning, right? And a term that we know called redlining of mortgages and the conditioning of FHA subsidies, right? For builders and, excuse me, my phone is making all kind of noises. For builders and homes not being able to be sold to African Americans, right? Rothstein argues that as a nation we have an obligation to remedy the lasting effects of this segregation and have paid an enormous price of sort of the way white income disparities and other inequalities. We paid that price by allowing this injustice to fester. This is what we have this class, right? The many faces of justice, right? So I didn't know we were going to read Rothstein, but hey, why not? So, since Brown versus Board of Education, right, a 1954 case that segregated schools or desegregated schools, the percentage of African American students in white majority schools increased to a peak at, I think it was like 43%. In the year I was a senior, in 1988. But today the trend is kind of going a different way. And there was a report that I read by UCLA's The Civil Rights Project showing that number had dropped to nearly half, if you will, to about 23%, which is comparative to 1968, right? And here in the 21st century, we're becoming more and more segregated, not less and less. While many sort of education and public policy scholars might argue, various reasons, a myriad of other reasons for this change. I don't know. Rothstein wants to say that this is the continuing legacy of housing discrimination. And as a country, we try to make a commitment, to abolish racial segregation. We kind of tried to begin a little bit, right, in the 1930s with legal cases that abolished the segregation in law schools, for instance, because the civil rights groups, they kind of figured that even judges could understand that you can't get a good education in a segregated law school. But they went back on attack with segregated grad schools and schools of pharmacy and stuff like that back in 1954. And I think it was the 60s where they abolished segregation in restaurants, right, with the Public Accommodations Act. Buses, right, water fountains, that kind of thing, right? And as a country, we said all that was immoral and unconstitutional, right? But the biggest segregation of it all, that we've really done nothing to try to remedy it, has all to do with housing. And so we've tried to wipe it off or wash it off or even sort of act like it's not there by calling it sort of natural, right? De facto. This residential, this housing segregation is in the fact that every metropolitan area in the country is residentially segregated, right? And I've lived in a few of them, right? And I've never lived in a city, really. Springfield is different because it's not really a metropolitan city. Now, look at Dayton, for instance. Cleveland. Right? Certainly the case in Cleveland, right? It eliminated segregation de jure. And every other life really didn't put the focus in on housing. And the most sort of powerful segregation still at play, as we just said, is the way in which racial boundaries, right, in these metropolitan areas are set up. And there's one way to think that maybe it begins with a clear reason is that it is much more difficult to sort of abolish segregation in residences than it is in any other areas. If we sort of try to abolish segregation, water fountains or buses, and the next day you can go drink at a water fountain. You can go get on the bus. We abolish segregation in schools. We can go to the school the next day. We may get some feedback, right? As the University of Georgia folk did, as the kids in Alabama did after Brown. But you can go. Pack up. I'm going to another school today. But if we passed a law that banned residential segregation, if you think about it, the next day, can that change? I think it's a little bit more difficult to undo, right? Because there's a system which is these areas that we sort of adopted and national sort of rationalization around de jure, by de facto, right? It excuses us to try to deal with the most difficult area of segregation. And that's really a theory that's probably been adopted across the political spectrum, left, right, middle. It's not just one hope by conservatives, but it's liberals too. And it's the myth that we've adopted, that we've developed, that we've given the term de facto segregation, that we say that we don't really, let me repeat that. We've developed, given a term de facto segregation, and sort of, we can't really do nothing about, we say we can't really do nothing about racial residential segregation, because unlike other segregations that we abolish, racial segregation is just by happenstance, by accident. It sort of just happened. It evolved because, there may be some private prejudices. Individual homeowners, they might not want to sell their home to an African American in a white neighborhood, or individual people saying, nah. Or real estate agents might have steered families from one place to another. Maybe African Americans and whites simply like to live with each other. Or people really are the same race. They just like to live with each other. Or maybe we lie to ourselves that African Americans really can't afford to move into white middle class neighborhoods. All these individual sort of accidental factors all add up to what? Racial segregation as sort of not governmentally sponsored, state sponsored, but it just was sort of as if the government was responsible for buses or water fountains or schools or blah blah blah. But de facto, that's accidentally. And then even the Supreme Court promoted this idea, right? Simply said the conservatives on the Supreme Court, liberals on the Supreme Court both accepted it as well as become part of our sort of national conversation. They promoted the idea that if you have de facto segregation, a segregation that's sort of happened by accident, there's nothing that really you can do about it, and there's not anything that could be done by the courts about de facto segregation. I mean, because they'll require having a racial remedy, an answer, and a racial remedy for something that really wasn't caused. They would argue by racial policy. Because only if you have de jure segregation, the Supreme Court says that segregation by government or law or public policy or regulation, then it's constitutionally permitted. In fact, it's not only that it's constitutionally permitted, but there's a constitutionally obligated sort of remedy if we have a violation of the Constitution, right? So what do? We just say, well, we just call it a myth of de facto segregation, so that way we don't have to deal with it. And we can live with racial segregation as long as we have people in this country who want to make decisions that the kind of decisions they want to make. And we don't have to deal with the historical federal and policies and that created the kind of situation that we're in. Right? So what are these policies, right? Where are we on this, right? What is it that, in fact, we are, sorry about that. What is it that, in fact, um, you know, we're talking about? We're talking about these policies. Well, obviously, redlining, right? And we know redlining to be a term that, appeared in public consciousness, especially in your generation, right? You all, around the Black Lives Matter movement. And sort of re- rebuilt itself or sort of retold itself in the Democratic primaries and the debate around social reparations. But the term itself, as we know, has deep and perhaps unexpected historical roots that date back to the New Deal, right? FDR, right? And so the Great Depression, right, caused a massive foreclosure and housing crisis in America. And the response, and sort of in response, if you will, one of the very first things that FDR's New Deal did was to establish the Homeowner Loan Corporation, or the HLC. And what the HLC did was to buy existing mortgages and then to issue new mortgages in order to determine whether or not a homeowner or potential homeowner would be able to pay them back. And then to determine how risky the investment would be, the HLC decided to create these sort of maps that we talked about in class yesterday across major metropolitan areas in the country, and to code these neighborhoods in terms of their safety. I put that in quote because of safety, physical, and safety, economic, and by economic safety, what we really mean is that what we expect people of color to contribute to our society. So it was like a grading system, with green being the safest, right? Red being the riskiest, sort of the most hazardous. And so these literally lines in a map. And so if you're on the red side, you literally were red lined. And this term was one of the biggest predictors that builders and surveyors of land used to determine if an area was risky or not. And the way to do that was the race of its residents. And so a neighborhood was marked red if any African Americans lived there. Any. Even if African Americans in the middle class, because again, remember why? Because they're coming out of segregation. So you're going to have middle class black folk with poor black folk. So they say, hey, if I see any black people, it's red line. And part of what the HLC believed was that what made these areas sort of African Americans brought down the value of property. Now, that's no stretch considering that historically America believes that African American was devalued, period, by their very existential being. So when you put their ontology within a physical space, then the physical space does not have value either, right? And so what they did was give sort of lower ratings to the area if it had African American family or families in it, or Latin families, or even Asian families, quite frankly, in the 1930s. Because they predicted that the neighborhood would change and the property there would be less value. And so the term redlining then is the red line that appraisers placed around neighborhoods on maps, right? And these maps were adopted government wide, and most importantly, by who? The FHA, Federal Housing Administration, and the VA. We talked about the other day with my granddad. And the VA, why? Because the VA was in charge of what? The GI Bill. And the GI Bill was crucial in allowing soldiers and ex-soldiers to gain access to mortgages returning from World War II. And so these new governmental-backed mortgages played a very important role in the spread of suburbanization after World War II. Why? Because it enabled families to just up and move to the suburbs and purchase their first home. And in so many ways, suburbanization was a government-sponsored program. Now we get into the meat of Rothstein's piece. So every time we look into a major metropolitan city and we see all the surrounding suburbs, Rothstein said we have to think about the fact that these were constructed areas to literally uproot and move white folk out of certain areas and then create an area that now we can allow for its burgeoning growth and its investment. While at the same time locking African Americans and other people of color out from the access of sort of suburban home ownership. And so while the nation's population growth occurred in the 1950s in the suburbs, early 60s, African Americans were excluded from that. And of those sort of new government developments and government-backed developments that were being built, these were sort of making even the lines of racial segregation even more thick. These all-white spaces of the suburbs of the 1950s and 60s. In the cities, these spaces of people of color. But the one thing that's really important about that is that a house is not just a place to live, right? But is an investment. And so ostentatiously, or sort of at the same time, when you lock black folk out of places to live and limit their ability to live, lower property values, you're locking African Americans out of the greatest opportunity for wealth accumulation. And so Rothstein argues, and so we can think about that government-sponsored segregation of housing contributes also substantially to the economic disparity of whites and blacks that will play out over generation after generation after generation after generation. And these policies are sort of meant that the African Americans who desired and were able to afford a house could really only live in racially segregated urban spaces. In the process, and sort of in the process, their homes, right, and communities deteriorated and lost value almost to a self-fulfilling prophecy. The HLC maps in major cities like where I'm from, Chicago or LA or St. Louis or Boston, sort of justify. You read the maps to justify. And then you have these urban renewal plant programs, right? Highlight that if you write your notes right now. Because urban renewal programs, they sound really good. But you have these urban renewal programs where you start building highways and high rises in the heart of neighborhoods coated with the red line. There's a video I'm linking to this, attaching or linking to this email, and it uses hip hop to tell that story. That's how I learned about highways and high rises through hip hop. They told the story. Destroyed neighborhoods and allow white America to avoid seeing them as they go into downtown from the suburbs that they have to pass by where they used to live, that now is inhabited by people of color. Huh. And so what happens when you build a highway or you build high rises? Well, you even further limit the housing stock. And so when you further limit the housing stock, and we talked about the other day, when you limit the housing stock, landlords take advantage of it, tenants get higher rents, stop performing maintenance, be happy you got a place to live. In cities like Chicago, Detroit, and Philadelphia, and the North Philly, and begin living in deteriorating housing communities, unsafe apartments, and neighborhoods going into deterioration as a neighborhood, house by house. Why? Because the lack of investment in cities, the further investment in suburbs. And it's compounded sort of a racial inequality and racial segregation throughout our metropolitan cities. And so now it's on, right? Because in 1960 and 68, Fair Housing Act, other civil rights laws meant to stop discriminatory practices. It's hard to reverse those effects now. And like I said, in the place where I live in Chicago, and Rothstein, spent a lot of time in Chicago. His story taught he does his early work in Chicago, right? Studying education and economic segregation through education. Right, Chicago is one of those, even today, the most segregated and economically unequal cities in America. And it sort of upholds, it reinforces what urban theorists and urban planners have said this whole time, which is these redlining maps are not just what is, but we can prophesy what is going to be. This is why Rothstein said it was orchestrated, because it was mapped out before it actually even occurred. And then when you do that, when you map it out and you divest from those communities. You ensure that even people with money, even black middle class folk, can't go nowhere. You lock them into poor education. You lock them into poor resources with food. You lock them into poor resources with other health and things like that they need. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so Rothstein wants to make the argument that redlining, he did not alone create racial segregation, but they played a really pivotal role in looking to history, or looking at history. It played a pivotal role, if you will, in even where we are today. And he wants us to know that it's not individual acts of racism or prejudice alone, but it's because of these policies and practices the federal and state governments enacted. And so housing segregation really just kind of messed up the American dream for black folk. From the Great Depression, when even 1/5 of the country was unemployed, everybody was poor. FDR's New Deal tried to revitalize the whole American economy, right? Created what we call the middle class, right? But it also cemented racial equality for generations to come. HLC, and you also heard of the PWA, the Public Works Administration, right? So make sure you have those in your notes. Both the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Public Works Administration, right? The Public Works Administration, we ain't talked about that yet. Let me talk about it real quick before I close. The PWA created affordable housing, and of course, affordable, segregated, separate housing. One for black folk, one for white folk. And we already said the FHA loans, back mortgages. Told banks, hey, somebody applies for a mortgage, go and give them. Even if they ain't got it yet, they'll get it, build them a house. If they don't pay it back, we'll guarantee the loan, unless they're black. And in some cases, it literally prohibited the occupancy of properties except by race. This is the story of America. And so some people would say the FDR program, as good as it was, it kind of screwed over generations of black people to come. Not just with wealth, we talk about education, we talk about, but also with criminal justice. Maybe I'll do a second lecture on criminal justice, because that's kind of my baby, if you will. But in summary, right, wealth. Homeownership is the driver of wealth, right? Who had the harder times of getting homes? Black people. Well, then boom. Even when homeownership was an option, homes in black neighborhoods were still valued 25% lower than homes of the white neighborhoods. It's happening now, even now. We just seen a story on CNN a couple years ago. And they're selling, last year, not even a couple years ago, last year, 2020. If I can find it, I'll forward it to you. About a black woman trying to sell her home. Even real estate agents undercutting the value. She sent her white friend over to act like she owned the house, raised the value. It's across the board. Homes in black neighborhoods, or black homes, or black even homeowners are less valuable because they're black bodies. And then we talk about economics and wealth, right? The plot even gets thicker, right? Because what? The red line neighborhoods pay higher insurance, higher interest rates, and they're denied more and more for mortgages. School funding, what? Through property taxes. So it affects what? Education. So we get most of our school funding from education through the property tax. That means that black cities can't produce as much money as white suburbs. You see the disparities. Pennies on a dollar compared to certain communities, certain suburban communities. And so you think, well, what about the Fair Housing Act of '68 or whatever? Well, redlining and discrimination in lending in housing became illegal in '68. But it's not like we reappropriated property values. We redistributed wealth, kind of made adjustments for the year, the decades of its adverse effect, let alone repair, the reparation word, repair that crucial period of detriment to project it out to the future. We didn't do that. And so all the property values that had been directly related to redlining, that put a premium on white communities, lower property value on black communities, we didn't even start from scratch and equalized all property values. We just continued to watch white suburban communities accumulate more and more wealth. Schools become less and less. I mean, white schools become less. White schools become more and more profitable, yielding more and more college graduates, bettering their income, and black communities having the opposite effect. That's where we are, guys. Like we said in class the other day, it's a good read, but it's a tough read. So I'm gonna let you go for now. See you in class on Tuesday. Take care. Stay strong.